So then you have the other side, which is becoming discerning in call it the more social context, becoming discerning to what is being expressed, as opposed to your listening, also now becoming discerning to what is the context and the construct, the content of what is being expressed. So now it's a noticing and sensing that which is trying to express itself. This is the other side of listening. So one is to become capable of listening in yourself, to have your instrument for receiving very well tuned. And the other is now being able to become, let's call it not really empathic, but something which uses empathy as a tool in being able to sense, but also has a lot of cognitive skills, the ability to listen closely, the ability to notice where distinctions are being made, the ability to be aware of when particular, like, are you guys familiar with the concept of a Russell conjugation?
No.
So this is once you've embodied capacity to notice Russell conjugation, you can now use this in a higher level of discernment. So Russell conjugation was coined by Bertrand Russell, who's a philosopher and mathematician, brought into public consciousness by Eric Weinstein to describe one of the more common rhetorical techniques, which is to carefully select from a bunch of ostensible synonyms the particular word that has a connotative characteristic that immediately biases the sense of a particular expression. So, for example, come here, she said. Come here, she growled. Come here, she sneered. In each case, the she X, the description, can be considered synonyms. They're all sort of descriptions of the fact that she expressed something, but they carry very distinct connotations. And if you're aware of the fact that that is extremely powerful, that the connotative framing that is associated with the selection of the particular terms that describe a phenomenon carries, call it 80% of the actual content of what is being expressed, because as humans, that's mostly what we're doing, is trying to engage in social signaling. What's our relationship to the people, not what's the content that is being sent. Then, once you've embodied that, you can actually have a high degree of discernment and say, oh, I see. What's really happening here is I'm being told that what is being said is bad, or I'm being told that the speaker is not part of my group, for example. And once you have that level of discernment, then flipping back to your internal, you're no longer being jerked around by the basic hominid need to know whether or not this is an in-group or an out-group expression, whether or not this is somebody who's part of my tribe or an enemy of my tribe, whether it's disgusting or it's sacred. But now you can be conscious of it, and you can then be conscious of how your body responds to those signals, and now you're becoming increasingly clear. You can actually be able to perceive what's going on. So then we can flip it. We can do the same thing at the mode of expression. So now I just did the mode of perception, of listening. If I also build my discernment and my clarity and expression, I can endeavor to become capable of expressing in a fashion that becomes possible of being heard with higher and higher degrees of clarity on the part of the listener. And now, of course, I have the third order, which is now creating a relationship. Like right now, we're in a process where we're both using our capacities to hear and to say, and we're also building a relationship as a collaboration that has the capacity to do things like discern what is the most meaningful thing to add to this conversation, which is a totally separate thing. And notice how distinct that is from being in a relationship with fake news. That as we build skillfulness to notice when a collaboration is forming, then you can respond. If somebody that you're interacting with is actually interacting in a way that is conducive to collaboration, they're evidencing a willingness and ability to listen and a skillfulness in expression that gives rise to the possibility of actually collaborating. Well, now you're in something that's real and can do things. Whereas if you're in a relationship with somebody who either is reckless in their expression or not clear in their listening, then there's only so much you can actually do. And well, then right? It's kind of like if you're parenting a child, if the child is in the process of throwing a tantrum, there's a lot of things you can't do. You can't begin to try to explain to them the reasons why things aren't working. You just have to deal with the fact they're in a tantrum. And so that level of discernment at parenting is an example of how you can use this capacity for internal, expressive, and relational discernment in the context of communication, the context of sense-making as a group.
This is such an important thing that you're touching on here that I'm not sure everyone's going to see it, but when I look at the news now and I see all of this conversation on like left versus right and offense and social justice war and this kind of stuff, and I imagine, we've had Jordan Peterson on before, and I imagine him giving these talks all over the world to certain mixed audiences and having people asking themselves the exact question that you asked is this person a member of my tribe or not? And just looking for those kind of key commands that it seemed like he's on one side or the other instead of actually listening to what he's saying. Like, this is such an important thing in our culture and our generation that I think people are overlooking, to learn how to listen properly and discern for yourself whether something is true or false.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. It is, in some sense, absurdly needful. So let's go back to this concept of accelerating change and just think about the context of listening. For effectively the totality of human history, which is to say from the beginning of humans being humans until about 15,000 years ago, every single being was born and raised among a group of other beings who were both genetically related to them and were also born and raised among a group of beings who were genetically related to them, right? The tribe. And think about what that means. What it means to have every single human being you literally have ever met is of the same tribe, and they have only met people who are of the same tribe, more or less. You literally never once sit down at a dinner table with people who you did not grow up with and who did not grow up with each other. At the level of what that means in terms of your underlying biological expectations of engaging in a conversation in comparison to now. Right? So today, let's fast forward. If you have history, you could just kind of do the fast forward of a cosmopolitanism. Today, we're in a situation where, well, first, in all likelihood, you've never actually even physically met the people you're interacting with, and that the heterogeneous basis of their experiences is, well, at the maximum that it's even maybe possible to be. You may not even share the same, well, it's quite likely you do not share even vaguely the same culture. And so right now I'm in a conversation with, Uvi, where are you actually from?
I'm from Russia originally. Mike is from Canada.
Canada and Russia are actually pretty good examples. So as a Russian who speaks English very well, we actually can have a nice relationship of knowing at kind of an intuitive level that there is going to be a cultural divide between us. Although, by the way, I think it's not as well understood how distant my particular cultural lineage is from yours. The Russian culture is actually further away from American culture than is, I think, conventionally grasped. Its origins are deeper and further. And then the Canadian case, we actually have the opposite problem, which is hilarious. You know, if I walk into China, there's a really neat category that exists called the obvious stranger, where most of the expectations of cultural norms are put into the category of stranger, where nobody has an expectation that I actually know how to respond appropriately to all the various subtle signals that are going on.
It's funny you use this example because it's exactly our experience from the last 7 years. Like, this is our lives now, is being the stranger in an environment like that. And we've talked about this quite a few times, like what it's like to meet someone that you know is from the same culture just because of their skin color, or that you know has a set of similar experiences just because of the way they look. And it's not racist, it's not assumptive, it's not a lot of things. It's just that everyone else is Asian here, except for that one other person I can spot out of the crowd.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that it's actually easier to be in relationship with somebody who is distinctly other than it is to be in relationship with somebody who is superficially close. You know, so one of the experiences that particularly Americans have in going into Canada is that there's a bit of confusion when a Canadian is communicating with you initially if they don't know that you're American. If they think you're Canadian, they're sending signals that are Canadian signals that you don't have a receiver for. And so you're not responding. Well, they're interpreting your non-response as some kind of actual response, usually in the direction of being an asshole. Now, given the fact that you're American, you might also be an asshole, but we're going to skip over that part. But once they recognize that you're an American, they switch and say, oh, it's weird. Like, you can't run it cognitively. At a physical level, you're actually able to know that, oh, okay, that actually explains certain things. And now you're going to move into kind of a more formal dialogue where you're going to say things a little bit more slowly. You're going to have lower expectations of how fluidly communication can happen. And when you're communicating with somebody who is quite distinctly distant, you're already in that formal dialogue. And so they may do something which in your culture would immediately be a sign of nastiness, but you're not going to necessarily jump to that conclusion because you're familiar with that gap. Because we're in a situation right now where we're trying to build an artfulness of communication absent embodied channels, meaning absent physical relationship. I can't read your body language. My body cannot read your body language. I can kind of see your facial expressions, but even that's not very effective. So absent, call it 98% of the actual signal in human relationships for almost the totality of human existence, across the totality of cultural differentiation that has occurred. And so in an arbitrary moment, I might be in conversation with people from 17 distinct cultures in social media. Well, obviously that's going to break down. Why would we expect otherwise? Why would we expect that we'd have any ability to communicate in those circumstances? And so yes, to the degree to which we want to be able to use this medium at all in anything other than to create conflict, it is most needful that we rather substantially upgrade our capacity for communication. Now we can return back to sort of what the primary point. The deep basis for upgrading capacity is this cycle that I just described, and it has the characteristic of being invariant, meaning that, okay, well, if I want to build my skillfulness in communicating with somebody from Vietnam, I could just go do a deep immersion in Vietnam and kind of build a bespoke one-time channel that is able to take into consideration what Vietnamese people are like. Well, okay, that works. That can happen. But if I want to do it where I'm actually adaptive and responsively to an arbitrarily large number of interlocutors over an arbitrarily large number of potential conversations who may themselves be changing rapidly because they're actually changing in relationship to who they're engaging with, that process doesn't work at all. I have to actually go deeper. I have to build this sensibility of very subtle discernment. And then what happens is everything snaps to a meta level. Have you heard the phrase find the others?
Mm-hmm.
The meta level is when you begin to recognize individuals who've actually developed a level of discernment of this kind. What you're now actually signaling is, oh, we can actually engage in a conversation at the level of collaboration. It's almost like the way that an old-fashioned modem protocol works. Remember the bong, bong, ding, ding? In the beginning, what happens is you're actually sending signals that are ultimately really just about establishing what level of communication and collaboration is actually available in this relationship. And when you find that as a consequence of those signals that you can actually enter into a truly collaborative relationship, a truly collaborative conversation, that's of a completely different kind. It's its own attractor that sits over here. It's not the same as what happens when you're engaging in sort of trying to navigate the blooming, buzzing confusion of social media. It's actually now a completely different space that can happen because the underlying capacities have been built among all the different participants. You can actually enter into a new space, which we could just call the space of collaboration, which can be invariant to all possible media of communication because everybody has taken responsibility for listening and responsibility for expressing. We call this rule omega, by the way, for thinking, for considering, for noticing, and for noticing things, for example, like your own sovereignty. Does it sound like this doesn't make sense to me? I'm out of my element and I'm getting a little bit confused, or I'm physically tired and I can't actually hold what's being presented here, or that particular concept or phrase doesn't make sense to me. Can we slow down? These kinds of things. And so you could say that that's all right. So now I'm going to have to see if I can put something together, which is really nice.
Okay, so let's go back to the practical applications of this way of thinking. What does it mean for the future, and how can we become better at communicating and building relationships?
All the way back in the beginning, we were talking to our hypothetical truck driver about the fact that we had a game, and that game had a certain way of being played, and that game was coming to an end, that it doesn't work anymore in the world that we live in. And in point of fact, if you look at it closely, it kind of had to come to an end because of the kind of game that it was. The good news is there's a new kind of game. It's still a game in the sense that we're all choosing to play it, but it's a very different kind of game. And there's a way for you to be able to notice when you're playing this new game. And when you found people who are themselves trying to play this new game and are building skillfulness in playing this new game, of course, these become the people that you can actually begin to play with and collectively and collaboratively begin to build more skillfulness in playing this new game. One of the aspects shows up as the difference between communication, journalism, social media in the old game, which is in the process of breaking down. It doesn't work, and it can't work. There's nothing about that way of being that can be resolved. We cannot try to retool that. We can't patch it. We can't temporarily put a spare tire on and get to the next stop. It's breaking down. It is done. And then in this new game, there's a way of communicating, a way of being in relationship that is completely able to resolve all the problems of the old game. It doesn't have the same kinds of problems. It doesn't involve things like how to deal with people who are using language to confuse. And we've actually filtered out that entire set of challenges. And once you've done that, you now have this, well, it actually looks like a graph or a mesh of people who are committed to a skillfulness of communication that has both the ability to benefit from all of their unique experiences and perceptions of what is going on in the world, and has the ability to form the basis of real relationships between and among them so they can actually make choices together. There's almost something there. Well, actually, it's an awful lot like what happened with the difference between personal computers and the internet. You can say that we're beginning to figure out how to extend this concept of the internet. What happens when you take things that, like computers, and you connect them so they can communicate. And then you make it so that they have protocols for communication so that they can all communicate with each other and share information in a way that has a certain fidelity to it. Well, this has to do what I'm talking about here, this process of building a certain skillfulness in communication, listening and expressing and informing relationships of collaboration is kind of like the internet for human communication. And it's the necessary corollary to the internet, the physical internet, that the physical substrate for communication, the medium of decentralized communication it's different than the medium of person-to-person embodied communication that we grew up in tribally. And it's different than broadcast communication that has been the primary mode of communication for the past millennium. And so it requires a different kind of skills. Completely different, just flat out different. You can't kludge the old approach, you have to build a new one. And you build the new one, like the way you build anything new, by starting at this loop, from discernment to embodiment. And you build those raw capacities to listen and to express, and then to enter into a space of collaboration. And then once you've done that, well, a whole lot of very powerful and important things follow.